You know, it seems like we have finally gotten through the worst of this COVID pandemic. We're getting somewhat back to normal. And it seems like this should be a time of relief and a time even to celebrate and a time in which we can exhale. But instead, over the past couple of months, we've seen how Putin and the Russians have invaded Ukraine, and now the world is kind of holding our collective breath over what's going to happen with that. And then if that's not enough, we have this major wildfire outside of town, and it's like, what? Are you kidding me? We just can't seem to get a break. And so I thought it might be helpful this morning if we just kind of took some deep breaths to just kind of relax this morning. If we take a few, just some deep breaths. Phew. It feels a little better, doesn't it? Just like we keep getting this kind of news that it's not very encouraging, is it? Well, I wanted to kind of go back to what I asked when I was at the start of the meeting, the gospel lesson, and that is what kind of emotions do you think the disciples had been going through over those last months or the 2-3 years that they'd been following Jesus? What do you think some of the emotions that they had been feeling? And you know, I know we're Lutherans, but you really can talk in church, so you can tell me.
Sometimes they were really happy.
Sometimes happy.
They might have been partially confused with what was going on.
Confused. So happy, confused. What other some emotions? If you'd been there, what do you think you would have been feeling during all of that?
Or disappointed.
Disappointed.
Maybe anxious.
Very
Sense of abandonment.
anxious. Sense of abandonment.
Feelings of not being good enough.
Feelings of not being good enough. Yeah. Awe. So all those things, wouldn't they? Been going through a whole lot of emotions and probably certainly some disbelief over what was happening. And then happiness was mentioned, but also joy, right? When they thought everything had failed. Jesus was dead, and then unbelievable, he's alive again. It's a sense of joy, huh? So it had been quite a month for Jesus' disciples, right? They had his closest friends had seen Jesus' triumphant arrival in Jerusalem when the crowds were celebrating him. But right after that, they saw his betrayal and his arrest and then his crucifixion. And you know, crucifixion was known to be the most brutal, painful, excruciating death possible. And the Roman government, that was the main power at that time, and were occupying different lands, one of which was Palestine. They used crucifixion to keep the people in submission. That's how the Roman government kept their boot on the throat of those in the lands that they were oppressing. And so crucifixion was seen as this sign of torture and brutality. And Jesus' disciples had witnessed that happen. Right? And kind of interesting, Putin is using the same tactics to keep his boot on the throat of the Ukrainians today, right? Public brutality. And that's what Jesus' disciples had witnessed in this man that they loved. Huh? And then unbelievably, the disciples witnessed the risen Christ, and he showed himself to them twice before the lesson, the account today, and then now the third time. And in today's gospel, we learn that they still don't understand the significance of what this was all about. Huh? So what do they do after they've seen all this that's taken place and all the emotions they've gone through, and they see Jesus crucified, but unbelievably he's alive again? What do they decide to do? They go fishing, right? Now we shouldn't be too hard on them, because that wasn't just a hobby. but they're actually going back to what they knew. That was their work, their livelihood. And so, Peter says, well, let's go fishing. And they do. And what happens? Then once again, the living Christ breaks into their usual lives. Huh? And so here we learn that ordinary people are called by God to make a difference wherever we are. And so first I want to think about ordinary people. And we tend to think of Jesus' disciples as somehow those 12 guys that he chose to help him accomplish his mission as being somehow different from us, or somehow exceptional, right? We think they must be different from us. And unfortunately, that's reinforced when we use the title of saint. Right? We think of St. Peter and St. James and St. John, and so we think they must somehow be different from you and I. But in reality, they were just very, very ordinary people. In fact, most of them were fishermen. And they didn't have any special training, and they were not exceptionally bright. And we're told today, for example, that Peter is out fishing naked. And that's a little like, and that's more information that I want to know about. So they're, quirky, kind of just regular guys. And the fact is that they never really understood what Jesus was talking about. So for example, when he was talking about how they were to be servants of all, instead they were arguing about what? Which one of them would be the greatest? Huh? And so it's always like Jesus is trying to teach them, and it's like, right? And of course, you gotta love Peter. He was always impetuous and kind of bumbling his way along, and even denied knowing Jesus, not once, twice, but 3 times, huh? And then all of the disciples abandoned Jesus at the end. And even after Jesus was raised from the dead, it appears they still don't get it. Right? And yet, the one thing that they did get right, mostly, was they were willing to follow Jesus. And as Jesus appears to them this 3rd time, he says to Peter, follow me. And so here we see that God works through ordinary people. And we're not talking about super saints or spiritual giants or super talented people, but ordinary, everyday people like you and me who are willing to follow Jesus. And so today Jesus comes to you and says, follow me. So ordinary people, called by God, and God calls us in baptism, and there God claims us as God's children, and calls us to participate in his work here on earth. And that is to advance God's kingdom, and to call people from death and into new life. And you might say, well, I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I'm too busy, or I don't know the Bible well enough. How can I follow Jesus? But when God calls you to something, God will provide you with all that you need. And in fact, it's important to rely on God and not just to rely on yourself. And so, if you're thinking about sharing your faith with somebody, maybe it's a family member or an acquaintance, somebody that's maybe struggling in their life right now, or going through a time of transition, and they're open to hearing about God and about Jesus. Before you talk to that person, you don't have to rely on yourself, but pray to God about it. Or maybe you're thinking about starting some kind of new volunteer ministry, and you're not too sure about it. Again, pray to God about it, and then listen, and God will help you. God will give you the right words to speak. And I know that, again, we don't have to rely on our own abilities. But in fact, it's good not to. Good to have a sense of humility about it, right? And say, God, I'm not sure what I should do here, what I should say. And then rely on Jesus to give you the right words, the right direction. Huh? So ordinary people, called by God, they're making a difference. And you know, we weren't put on this earth just to consume resources, pollute the environment, take up space and die. We were put on this earth for something much greater than that, right? You and I were put on this earth to make a difference. And it's interesting, when Jesus comes to the disciples on the shore of the lake, the Sea of Galilee or Tiberias, whichever, same place, same body of water, he's cooking over a fire of charcoal. And the only other time that a fire of coals is mentioned there's only 2 times it's mentioned, both times in John's Gospel. And the other time it's mentioned is when Peter warmed himself over a charcoal fire as he denied knowing Jesus. Right? And now Jesus will give him a chance to redeem himself beside another charcoal fire. And isn't that beautiful? I just love the symmetry of that. But it started with Peter, and here's this act of redemption that's sort of bookends for Peter, right? Around this charcoal fire. And just as Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times, Jesus will now ask Peter 3 times. What's Jesus going to ask Peter?
Do you love me?
Do you love me, Peter? Right? And each time Peter will respond, how does Peter respond? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Huh? And what a beautiful moment that is, isn't that? What a tender moment there with Jesus and Peter, huh? As Jesus offers this love to Peter and this redemption to Peter, huh? And we can only imagine what Peter must have been feeling like, given the fact that he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Huh? And now this beautiful moment where Jesus comes to Peter with love and tenderness. Huh? So think of the times that you and I have made mistakes in our lives and have done things that have hurt others, or that have hurt ourselves, or that have hurt the heart of God. Huh? And think of the times that you and I have denied knowing Jesus. And we do that in lots of ways, subtle ways, or just our apathy toward Jesus. Huh? But Jesus doesn't come to us in anger, but we see that Jesus comes to us in tenderness. Huh? And Jesus asks, do you love me? And then he offers us forgiveness and a fresh start. Huh? And Jesus' conversation with the disciples is done over a meal of bread and fish. And he comes to offer them this kind of redemption, right? And likewise, Jesus comes to us in a meal and offers us not bread and fish, but bread and wine. And we'll come to this meal in a few moments. In this meal, we are reminded that Jesus gave his body and blood for us on the cross and rose from the dead, that we can have the promise of forgiveness and a fresh start and purpose for living each day, and even the promise of an eternal home with God. Now, do you think that's some good news? That's some good news, huh? And that's what we celebrate at Easter, and we celebrate each Sunday. Huh? And so when we come to the Lord's Supper and come to this meal that Jesus offers to you and me, we gather as a community of faith where we are forgiven and fed and then sent out to make a difference in the world. And as we go out into our daily lives with all of the ups and downs, Jesus meets us there, where we are at. And Jesus doesn't come to embarrass us over our mistakes and sins, but he doesn't let us off the hook either. He doesn't say, oh, forget about it. But instead he asked, do you love me more than these? He asked, do you love me enough to really commit yourself to follow as a disciple? You love me enough to set a new standard of love and forgiveness in your relationships. Do you love me enough to tell your neighbors about me? Do you love me more than all that material stuff that we get so caught up in trying to get more and more of? Jesus says, do you love me more than these? And each time that Peter said he loved Jesus, Jesus responded by saying, feed my lambs, tend my sheep. He was saying, if you love me, take care of those little ones whom I love. Jesus says, do you love me? Well, if so, go out and care for those in need. Tend the sheep, care for the hurting and the hungry, and tend all of creation. Make a difference in the lives of others. Share the good news. And where are we then to serve others and share the good news of God's love and grace? Well, wherever we are. And you know, we used to think you had to get on a plane and fly to another country somewhere else if you wanted to do mission work. But now we know that the mission field has come to us, right? And it's right outside the doors of this building. It's right outside the doors of your home. There are people all around us who are dying to hear good news. We have good news to share. That in Jesus we find forgiveness, a fresh start, purpose for living each day, and even the promise of an eternal home with God. We have good news to share wherever we are, right? Every day. And it's important to see the hand of God at work in our everyday lives, and to see our hands as part of God's work. Whether those hands are diapering a baby, caring for a loved one, teaching a classroom, repairing an automobile, working in technology, cooking a meal, tending to flowers. Our hands are God's hands, claimed by God at baptism for the use of God's purposes on earth. And when you see that, then, all of life becomes sacred, and all of life becomes meaningful. Right? And we see that God is using our hands, our actions, to accomplish God's purposes here. And all of life becomes sacred and meaningful. So today, we think about how ordinary people like you and me are what? Called by God, making a difference wherever we are. And all God's people say,
Amen.